Josephine Calloway carried her blue ribbon peach preserves to the church social in her only good dress. She had pressed that dress the night before. She had polished the jar until it caught the light. And Harriet Ashby lifted it off the table with two gloved fingers, the way you'd lift something dead, and set it down at the servant's end of the trestle. Josie did not flush. She did not argue. She only watched. Then Harriet turned, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "We don't seat saloon trash with decent wives, dear. Sing for your supper somewhere else." 40 women of the Cottonwood Bend Ladies' Aid heard it. Not one of them spoke. Josie walked to the churchyard fence. She took a small cloth-bound ledger from her reticule. She wrote a single figure beside the name Cattlemen's Trust. Then she closed the book. If you've ever been judged for where you came from instead of who you became, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find a place in you, subscribe and stay a while. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I read every one. Now, let me take you back to a dry, golden year in the Wyoming Territory, and a woman the whole valley thought they had measured. It was 1881. Cottonwood Bend sat in a shallow bowl of grass with the mountains blue behind it, and for most of the year it was the prettiest place a person could stand. Cattle on the hills, cottonwood along the creek, a church, a mercantile, a bank with a stone face, and a saloon at the far end of the street called the Gilded Spur. That saloon is where our story starts. Because that is where Josie started, and the town never let her forget it. She had come off a wagon at 19 with nothing but a carpet bag and a voice. Her people were gone. Her money was gone. And a man named Bill Deal, who ran the spur, heard her sing 2 lines and hired her on the spot. She sang there 3 years. She was good. On a Saturday night, the spur was full of drovers 3 deep at the bar, and when Josie stood up under the lamps, the room went quiet the way a church goes quiet. Her first night on that little stage, a drover in the front flicked a coin at her feet. A silver dollar, tarnished near black, worn thin at the edge. He meant it as a jibe, the way a man throws a bone. "Sing, girl," some of the others laughed. And Josie, 19 years old and 1,000 miles from anyone who loved her, bent down in front of all of them and picked it up. She did not throw it back. She did not weep. She slipped it into her glove, and she finished the song. She kept that dollar. Through everything, she kept it. Now here is the thing the town never bothered to learn about her. Josie could sing, yes, but that was the smallest part of what she could do. Bill Deal found it out by accident. One night his bookkeeper drank himself sideways and left the Spur's ledgers in a shameful heap, and Bill, cursing, spread them on the bar. Josie came down off the stage in her stage dress and looked at the columns for a minute. Then, she took up the pencil. She found $4 he'd been cheated of by the beer man. She found a mistake in the tax. She squared 3 months of accounts before the bar closed, and she did it in her head faster than the men could do it on paper. Bill kept her at the books after that. And the men at the bar, when they heard, they laughed about it the way men laugh about a dog that can count. "A woman who can sing is one thing," old Silas Pruitt said one evening, and Silas was the cashier down at the Cattlemen's Trust, so he thought himself an authority. "A woman who can add, now that's a dangerous thing. Best keep her singing." And the bar laughed with him. Nobody heard the warning inside the joke. Nobody ever does. Every morning before the Spur woke up, Josie sat at the end of the counter with a cup of coffee going cold and read the finance column of the Cattlemen's Gazette. Line by line. Cattle prices out of Chicago. The going rate on a season note. Which banks were flush and which were papering over a thin reserve with brave words. She read it the way other women read scripture. She did not fully know why, only that numbers told the truth even when everyone in the room was lying, and there was a comfort in that. A permanence. That is who she was the day Amos Calloway walked into the Gilded Spur. Amos was 49 then, a rancher out on the West Benches, widowed 9 years and gone quiet with it. He'd come in out of a cold rain to wait out the weather, and he took a corner table and he heard her sing. He came back the next Saturday. And the one after that. He never once threw a coin. He'd take off his hat when she stepped up, like she was somebody, and he'd put it back on when she finished. That was all. For months, that was all. Then one night the bookkeeper's mess was on the bar again, and Amos watched her fix it, and he said, "Careful as a man crossing ice. You've got a rare head on you, Miss Josephine. Not, you've got a fine voice." Her head. He saw her head. She married him in the spring, in the little church, in front of the same God the Ladies' Aid claimed for their own. Amos married her because he loved her, and because he was lonesome, and because a man of sense knows a good partner when the Lord sets one in front of him. He did not marry her to save her. She has never once needed saving. But the valley told it another way before the rice was off her hair. She trapped him. That was the verdict. A saloon girl with a pretty face and no people, and she'd got her hooks into a decent widowed man with land and cattle and a name. Poor Amos. Poor foolish Amos. They said it in the mercantile, and they said it on the church steps, and the loudest voice saying it belonged to Harriet Ashby, whose husband Ezra ran the biggest herd in the county and sat on the board of the Cattlemen's Trust. Harriet measured every soul in the valley by the pew they sat in and the people they came from. And Josie had come from nowhere, up out of a saloon, and there was no place in Harriet's ledger for a woman like that except at the bottom. But Josie did not fold up small and beg. She went out to the west benches, and she made herself a rancher's wife. She learned the stock. She learned the seasons. And she took up the ranch's account book the way she'd taken up the spurs, and inside a year she knew that book better than Amos did. Amos was an honest hand with cattle and a poor hand with figures, and he was too proud to say so. But he let her keep the ledger. That was trust, even if he'd have blushed to name it. One morning in the second spring the Gazette came up the stage road as always, and Josie read the finance column at her own kitchen table now, with bread rising by the stove. Her eye stopped on a small notice near the bottom. Cattlemen's Trust of Cottonwood Bend, shares offered. She read it twice. She took her pencil, and she circled the line, and for a long moment she just sat with her hand flat on the paper. Then she got up and pulled the bread and said nothing to anybody. That was the year they began, in earnest, to shut the door on her. It started so small a kinder person might have missed it. The Ladies' Aid kept a roll, a leather book of every proper wife in the valley, and to be on that roll was to be somebody. Josie's name had been written in when she married Amos, because they could not quite refuse the wife of a Calloway to her face. But that spring, when the roll was read aloud at the quilting, her name was not in it. Struck out. A neat line through Josephine Calloway, done in Harriet's own hand, and no explanation offered because none was thought owing. Ruth Vane, a young wife married to a small honest rancher named Hollis Vane, sat near the back and saw the line through the name and went red to her ears and said nothing. Ruth was decent. Ruth was also afraid of Harriet, the way most of them were. And so nobody spoke, and the roll was closed, and Josie was off it. Josie heard about it the way you always hear about these things, sideways, from a neighbor woman who told it half as gossip and half as sympathy. Josie thanked her for the coffee and changed the subject, but that night she wrote something in her clothbound ledger, the little private one, and she did not read it aloud even to Amos. Then came the christening. The deacon and his wife had a new baby, and there was to be a christening, and Josie, who could sew a fine seam, had made the child a christening gown, white lawn, with a hem of tatted lace that had cost her a week of evenings. She sent it ahead as a gift with her card. And 3 days later it came back. Returned, with a note in a hand she knew, saying the parcel had been misdirected, and here it was. Come home. Misdirected, to her own house, from a valley that could find any ranch in the dark. The gown was folded exactly as she'd folded it. The lace was uncrushed. Nobody had even opened it. Amos found her at the table with the parcel in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, still as a pond. "Josie," he said. He'd have ridden into town and said a hard word to somebody if she'd let him. She looked up at him, and she smiled, and it was a real smile, only tired at the edges. "It's a fine gown," she said. "It'll keep. Some child will wear it." And she got up and put it away in the cedar chest, and that was the end of it, out loud. But here is what you must understand about Josie Calloway, the thing the Valley never grasped. She believed a lady never defends herself out loud. She believed dignity meant you did not scrap in the street like a dog. And the Valley read that stillness as weakness. They saw a woman who took her medicine and stayed quiet, and they thought, there, she knows her place at last. They mistook the quiet for surrender. It was not surrender. It was arithmetic. She was counting. Every slight, every closed door, every neat line through a name, she was writing it down in a book they could not see, and she was very, very patient, and patience in a person who can add is the most dangerous thing in the world. Around that same time, something happened that nobody in the Valley noticed, least of all Josie's enemies. A homesteader named Tandy, out past the Vane place, gave it up. The dry seasons had beaten him, and he was pulling for Oregon with his family in a wagon. Now Amos had wintered 40 head of Tandy's stock the year before, on a promise of pay, and Tandy came out to the Calloway place hat in hand to say he couldn't pay it. He had no cash. He was leaving broke. Amos, being Amos, was ready to shake the man's hand and wish him well and eat the loss. But Josie came out onto the porch drying her hands and asked, gentle, whether Mr. Tandy had anything at all to settle with. "Land," said Tandy. He had a note on a strip of land down along the creek, adjoining the Vanes, but it was near worthless, mortgaged past its worth, and the bank held a lien and would take it if a payment slipped. He'd give her the note if she wanted it, for the wintering, though it wasn't worth the paper. "I'll take it," Josie said. "Just to be neighborly." Amos looked at her sideways. He thought she was being soft-hearted, taking a dead man's land to let a poor family go with their pride. Tandy signed the note over grateful and drove off west, and Amos put it out of his mind inside a week. A worthless paper on a strip of dry ground. He never thought of it again. But Josie put that note in the cedar chest next to the christening gown, and she remembered exactly what the bank did to such notes. She'd read it in the Gazette, and she'd seen it at the counter. When a small man defaulted, the Cattlemen's Trust discounted his paper cruel and hard, bought the debt for pennies, and took the land whole. They were merciless to the small and gentle to the great. She had watched them do it. And she had watched, too, the way the bank's own reserves in the Gazette had begun to look a little thin, a little brave, a little papered over. A bank that lends hard to the mighty in a wet year is a bank that trembles in a dry one. She said none of this to anyone. She put the kettle on. Now I have to tell you about the day at the harvest fair, because that is the day the whole valley was in one place, and that is the day they went too far. The harvest fair came at the tail of the summer, on the fairgrounds by the creek, and everyone came. The ranch families in their best, the town in its Sunday clothes, tents and trestle tables, a fiddler, races for the boys and the judging, pies and jams and needlework and stock, ribbons pinned by the fair committee. The preserves were judged blind. That was the rule, the proud rule of the fair, that the jars were numbered and the judges tasted them without knowing whose was whose, so that the best jam won on its own honest merit, and nothing else. Josie entered her peach preserves under her number. She did not put her name where the judges could see it. She let the peaches speak. And the peaches won. Blind, fair, and clean, 3 judges tasting and agreeing. Her jar took the blue ribbon over every other jam in the valley, over Harriet Ashby's own strawberry, which had taken the blue 3 years running. The committee man carried the ribbon to the table to pin it on the winning jar, and he read the number, and he read the name beneath it, and you could see him falter. Calloway, he hesitated with the ribbon in his hand, and Harriet Ashby, who had been standing near with a crowd of the ranch wives, saw the whole thing, saw the blue ribbon going to Josie's jar. And Harriet stepped forward in front of God and the entire valley, and she took the ribbon out of the committeeman's fingers. "No saloon girl takes a ribbon from decent wives," she said. Loud, clear so, the fiddler stopped and the whole crowd turned. "There's been a mistake." And she turned with the blue ribbon in her hand, and she pinned it on Ruth Vane's jar. On poor young Ruth, who had entered a modest peach of her own. Ruth's face went white, then red. Ruth knew. Ruth knew her jam had not won, and knew whose had, and knew she was being used as a knife against another woman. She opened her mouth. And then she looked at Harriet, and she shut it again, and she stood there with the stolen ribbon on her jar and shame all over her face. The whole valley watched. Hundreds of them. Waiting to see the saloon girl break. Josie stepped up to the judge's table. She was calm as still water. She reached into her glove, and she took out the tarnished silver dollar. The one thrown at her feet 9 years before, worn thin and near black. And she set it down on the table in front of the judges, gentle, with a small click on the wood. "For my entry fee," she said. That was all. Not a tear, not a raised voice. And she turned and walked out of the fairground with her back straight and her chin level, through a crowd that parted for her, and did not say one word. And she got up on the wagon beside her husband and rode home. Amis's jaw was set like a trap the whole way. Josie looked at the mountains and said nothing. But her hand, on the seat between them, found his and held it. They thought that was her broken. That was the story they told for weeks. Did you see her at the fair? Did you see her slink off? They put her at the bottom of the ledger and closed the book and felt, all of them, the deep animal comfort of a world where everyone stays in their place. They should have watched her hands. She'd left the dollar on the table on purpose. She was done paying for a seat at their table. She was going to buy the whole building, because that was the summer everything turned, though nobody knew it yet but her. That was the summer the sky dried up. It did not rain in June. It did not rain in July. The creek fell to a trickle and then to stones. The grass, that beautiful blue-green grass that made the valley rich, went yellow and then went to dust, and the cattle grew ribby on it, and the men rode out grim in the mornings to count how many the dry had cost them overnight. And when the drought bit the valley, cattle prices fell too, because the whole territory was selling off starving stock at once, and there is no worse thing than being forced to sell cheap, because you cannot afford to keep. It was ruin, slow and hot, all summer long. And here is what the big men did. Here is what Ezra Ashby did. Loudest of all. Instead of selling down his herd and taking his losses like a careful man, Ezra rode into the Cattlemen's trust, and he mortgaged. He borrowed against his land and his stock to buy feed and to hold his cattle through the dry, betting on rain, betting on a rebound, betting on his own bigness. Drought bravado, the old-timers called it. Ezra Ashby was too proud to shrink. And the other ranch husbands, seeing Ezra hold, held too, and borrowed too, deeper and deeper into the bank, until half the valley's grass was carrying the bank's paper, and every big man in Cottonwood Bend owed the Cattlemen's trust more than his land was worth in a dry year. Not one of them stopped to ask a simple question. Who holds the bank's paper? Who does the bank owe? Whose money, when it comes down to it, is really at the counter? Ezra signed his notes and never once thought past the ink. Out on the west benches, Josie sat at her kitchen table on the hot, still nights and did what she always did. She counted. She was not gleeful about it. Understand that. There was pain in her, watching a whole valley go down, watching families she pitied dig themselves under. But somewhere that summer the pain in her turned to resolve, quiet and cold and steady as the numbers themselves. She had been counting slights for 2 years. Now, she counted something else. She counted her saloon savings first, 3 years of a good singer's wage, and she'd saved near all of it because she'd never had anyone to spend it on and she'd never trusted a bank to hold it. It was more than the valley would have believed. A singer who reads the finance column and lives plain and never gambles saves a startling pile in 3 years. She counted Amos's honest profit. 3 seasons of a ranch run careful and clean, before the drought, kept and reinvested by a woman who understood a ledger. Amos had thought himself just getting by. He had no idea, none, how much his quiet wife had built for him out of his own herd, because he never read the book she kept. And she counted the land notes, the Tandy note from the cedar chest, and 1 or 2 others like it she'd taken up quiet over the past year, just to be neighborly, each one a claim on ground the bank would have swallowed. Alone they were nothing. Together, with the savings and the profit behind them, they were a foundation. Then she took out the Gazette, and she read the bank's own public share offer again, the one she'd circled in the spring, and she read the reserve figures the Cattlemen's Trust was required to publish, and she saw, plain as a sum a child could check, what the proud men of the valley could not see, because they never looked. The bank had lent itself thin. It had poured its money out to the big ranchers on drought bravado, and if those notes went bad, the bank went with them. And the bank's own shares, the ownership of the whole stone-faced institution, could be had, right now, by anyone with cash in hand and the nerve to move. Because the men who owned it were the same men drowning in debt to it, and they'd sooner sell shares to raise cash than admit they were sinking. Josie sat back in her chair. The lamp guttered. Somewhere out on the dry hills a cow bawled for water, and she understood the whole shape of it at once, the way she'd understood the Spurs' crooked ledger in a single minute 9 years before. The valley owed the bank. The bank could be bought. And she had the money to buy it. She wrote to Cheyenne the next day, not to a man she knew, to a discreet broker whose name she'd read in the finance column, a firm that bought and sold territorial bank paper for clients who wished to stay quiet. She wrote in a plain, steady hand, and she signed her own name, Josephine Calloway, because everything she meant to do was going to be lawful and true, done in the open eye of the law, even while it stayed hidden from the valley. There would be no lie in it anywhere. That mattered to her more than the town would ever have credited. She began to buy shares. Quiet, legal, in her own name. A block here, a block there, as the desperate owners sold to raise their drought cash, each of them glad of a buyer, and none of them told, or caring to ask, who the buyer was. The broker moved the paper. The money went east, and the ownership came west, in her name, into a strong box in a Cheyenne vault. And in the fall, the broker wrote her a letter that she read, standing up by the mailbox in the wind, and that she folded and put inside her dress against her heart. A controlling block can be had, the letter said. Enough to hold the majority of the Cattlemen's Trust outright, the bank itself, the presidency, the whole of it. But move before the spring notes come due. Once the ranchers must pay or beg, the shares will not be loose in the market. Move now, or lose the chance. She stood in the wind a long time with that letter against her heart. There was more money needed than she yet had gathered. A controlling block is not a handful of shares. It would take everything. The savings, the profit, the notes leveraged to the hilt. And it would take Amos. Not his consent as a master gives consent. His trust as a partner gives it. Because some of what she'd have to pledge touched the ranch, and she would not, ever, move a dollar of the thing they'd built together without his eyes open. So one evening at the end of that dry summer, with the supper cleared and the lamp between them, Josie told her husband everything. She laid the little cloth-bound ledger on the table. She showed him the savings he'd never known the size of. She showed him what his own careful ranching had truly earned. She showed him the land notes and the Gazette figures and the broker's letters, all of it, in order, the way you build a proof." And she told him, in her level, quiet voice, what she meant to do. Buy the bank. The whole bank. Own the Cattlemen's Trust of Cottonwood Bend, lawfully and outright, in her own name, the bank that half the valley now owed, the bank whose board had struck her name and stolen her ribbon and sent back her gift. Amos Calloway sat very still. And here I have to be honest with you about Amos, because he was a good man, but he was a proud one, and pride is a slow thing to move. His first feeling was not joy. His first feeling was the old cold pride rising up, the rancher's pride, the man's pride, that his wife had built this in silence, that she had money he'd never dreamed of, that she was carrying them. That the whole world's whisper about poor foolish Amos and the saloon girl might, in some upside-down way, have a truth in it he'd never suspected. She was the strong one. She had always been the strong one. For a moment that was a hard thing to swallow, and it showed in his face, and Josie watched him swallow it and said nothing, and let him. And then Amos Calloway did the finest thing he ever did. He put his pride down. He reached across the table, and he put his rough old hand over the little ledger and over her hand on top of it. And he looked at his wife, and he said, "You've been carrying us this whole time." And I never once looked in the book. His voice caught. "Do it, Josie. Whatever you need of mine, it's yours." It always was. Buy the whole rotten bank, and God help them. That was the first true partnership between them. Not the wedding. This, 2 people and 1 lamp and an open book, and a man who chose to be glad of a strong wife instead of shamed by her. The valley thought she'd trapped him. The valley had it exactly backward. He'd had the good sense to love a woman worth 10 of any wife on Harriet Ashby's roll, and now, at last, he knew it all the way down, and he was not too small to say so. They pledged it all that night. Everything they had, gathered into one hand, and there was a number under it all, an anchor Josie had worked out to the dollar. When the spring notes came due, 30 days after the spring roundup, that was the valley's custom, the whole year's borrowing falling due at once in one hard reckoning, the ranchers of Cottonwood Bend would owe the Cattlemen's Trust more money than the dry valley could possibly raise. And the largest single note of all, the lead note that the whole shaky tower leaned on, was Ezra Ashby's. $6,200 against the Ashby range. Ezra had borrowed the deepest because Ezra was the proudest, and the deepest borrower is always the one with the most to lose when the note falls due and there is no rain and no buyer and no mercy at the counter. $6,200. Josie wrote the figure in her ledger and looked at it a long time. The woman Harriet Ashby had called saloon trash before the whole valley was about to hold Harriet Ashby's husband's paper in her own 2 hands. But not yet. Not quite yet. The controlling block still had to be signed for, in person, in Cheyenne, with the money on the table, $9,400, everything they had scraped and built and pledged, laid down at once for 51% of the Cattlemen's Trust and the presidency that came with it. Miss it, and the chance was gone. The broker had been plain. Move before the spring notes, or the shares lock up, and the moment passes, and the valley's proud men sail, on never knowing how close a reckoning had come. So, in the last week of that dry autumn, Josie Calloway packed a small bag. She kissed her husband on the porch in the gray morning cold. And she climbed onto the eastbound stage for Cheyenne alone, with the broker's letter against her heart, and $9,400 arranged in bank drafts in her reticule, and the tarnished silver dollar, the coin thrown at her feet 9 years before. The coin she'd left on the judge's table and gone back for in the dark that same night. Because she was never, ever going to leave it behind, riding quiet in her glove. She told no one in the valley where she was going. Not one soul. She let them think whatever they cared to think about the saloon woman gone off on the stage. Harriet was at that very hour telling the ladies' aid that Ezra would ride down to the bank come spring and set the whole valley's affairs to rights, the way a real man did, and the wives were nodding, and the drought lay on the hills. And nobody in Cottonwood Bend had the first idea that the quietest woman among them was sitting up straight in a rocking stagecoach with the mountains sliding by, running the figures one last time in her head, riding east to buy the ground they all stood on. The stage crested the pass. Cheyenne lay ahead in the brown distance, and in it a broker's office, and a lawyer, and a set of papers waiting to be signed. And Josie Calloway looked out at the road and touched the hard round shape of the old silver dollar through the leather of her glove, and did not smile. There would be time for that later. First there was a name to sign. The broker's office in Cheyenne smelled of ink and coal smoke, a narrow room, a high desk, a window gone yellow with dust. The lawyer was a thin man in a black coat, and he laid the papers out one at a time, the way a man deals cards he knows are winning. Josie read every line. She had come too far to sign on trust. There was the share certificate. There was the transfer of the controlling block. 51% of the Cattlemen's Trust of Cottonwood Bend, bought and paid for, in her own name. Not Amos's name. Hers, Josephine Calloway. She took the bank drafts from her reticule and set them on the desk. $9,400. Every cent of it counted twice on the ride east, and once more that morning in her room at the hotel. Saloon savings, 3 seasons of Amos's honest herd profit. The land notes turned to cash. It had taken her 9 years to gather, though she did not think of it that way. She thought of it as a bill coming due. The lawyer counted the drafts. He nodded. He dipped the pen and turned it toward her. Josie pulled off her right glove. The silver dollar rolled loose into her palm, tarnished and thin, worn smooth by 9 years of her thumb. She set it on the corner of the desk where she could see it. Then she took the pen. She signed slow. She wanted to remember the shape of her own name going onto that page. The lawyer blotted it, folded it, sealed it. He said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway. You are the majority owner of the Cattlemen's Trust." Josie put the glove back on with the coin inside it. "Thank you," she said. That was all. She did not smile. Not there. Not yet. Outside, the wind came down off the plains cold and clean. She stood a moment on the boardwalk and let it push at her skirts. Somewhere west of her, past the pass, past the brown miles, 40 women were sitting at a quilting frame believing they knew exactly who she was. They did not know the first thing. She rode the stage home the next morning. She told no one where she had been. She let them think what they thought. Amos met her at the porch in the gray cold, and she put the certificate in his hands, and he read it twice, and his eyes went wet at the corners, and he said, "Josie," just her name. She held him a long while. That was the one part of it that was only theirs. Winter came down hard on the dry hills. The valley men had borrowed deep to hold their herds through the drought, and now they waited on spring, waited on grass, waited on the notes that would come due 30 days after the spring roundup. They talked at the store about weather and beef prices. They did not talk about the bank. A man's paper was his own business, and every one of them believed the bank was still a gentleman's club run by gentlemen who understood a hard year. At the counter of the Cattlemen's Trust, Silas Pruitt went on as he always had. He was an old cashier with a gold watch chain and a habit of looking at a person's shoes before their face. Word had reached him from Cheyenne that a block of shares had changed hands. He did not trouble himself over it. Some woman bought paper through a broker, he told the young clerk. A speculator's toy. City money. It'll come to nothing. He did not read the name on the transfer. It was filed in a drawer he considered beneath him. A woman's foolishness. He had a bank to run. Spring broke slow. The grass came up thin, but it came. The roundup went out and came back, and the clock started ticking on the notes, and the ranch husbands rode into town one after another to talk to Silas Pruitt about a little more time. Ezra Ashby came first, because Ezra Ashby was always first. He had the biggest herd in the county and the biggest note under it, $6,200 against the Ashby range. He came in his good coat with his chin up, and he leaned on the counter like he owned it, and he said, "Silas, the grass is late. I'll want 30 more days on the lead note. You know I'm good for it." Pruitt spread his hands. "That's board business now, Ezra. There's been changes upstairs. New majority holder wants everything brought to the board direct." He lowered his voice like a man sharing a joke. "Between you and me, some outside party bought in. Doesn't understand cattle. We'll manage them." He winked. "Come to the board meeting. We'll set it all straight, gentleman to gentleman." Ezra laughed. "Long as it isn't run by some woman now," he said. The young clerk at the end of the counter opened his mouth. "It's a missus, that'll do," Pruitt snapped. He put a hand flat on the ledger. "Fetch the Hardesty file." The clerk shut his mouth and went. Ezra never heard the rest. He tipped his hat and walked out into the spring sun, satisfied, and rode home to tell Harriet the bank would be handled. It came that close. One word from a boy, and the whole game turned over early. But Pruitt's pride shut the door on it, the way pride does, and the valley went on believing what it wanted to believe. The rest of the husbands came the same way through those weeks. Tom Ledbetter, who'd mortgaged his south quarter. The Prather brothers. Deacon Hollis Vane, who came quietest of all, because Hollis Vane was near ruined and knew it and would not pretend otherwise. He was a small, honest rancher with a wife named Ruth and not enough grass, and his note was small, but it was more than he could carry, and he did not lean on the counter or talk about being good for it. He just asked, plain and low, whether there was any mercy in the bank for a man who'd done everything right and still come up short. Pruitt told him the same as the rest. Board business now, bring it to the meeting. None of them knew. Every man in that valley rode home believing he'd be pleading his case to Silas Pruitt and a table of old cattlemen who understood him. Not one of them read the name in the drawer. And in the church on Sunday, Harriet Ashby sat in the third pew where she always sat, and after the service she stood on the steps in her good bonnet and told the wives around her, "Ezra's seen to the bank. He'll set the whole valley's affairs to rights come the meeting. That's what a man does. He handles it." The wives nodded. Ruth Vane stood at the edge of them with her hands folded, saying nothing, because Ruth Vane had a note she couldn't pay too, and a memory of a blue ribbon pinned on her chest that she hadn't earned and hadn't wanted. Josie was not at church that morning. Her name had been struck from the roll 2 years back. She was home at the ranch running the figures, and she did not need to hear Harriet to know exactly what Harriet was saying. She could have written it out word for word. Then the trouble came, the way trouble does, all at once. Silas Pruitt finally read the name in the drawer. He'd gone looking for the transfer to show the board how little the outside party had bought, meaning to reassure the old men that the bank was still theirs. He unfolded the paper. He saw the signature. Josephine Calloway. He knew the name. Everyone in the valley knew the name. The Saloon woman. Amos Calloway's second wife. The one Harriet Ashby had run off the church roll. Pruitt sat down hard in his chair. He did not tell the valley. He told the old board, the 3 cattlemen who'd sat the Cattlemen's trust since before the drought, and he told them behind a closed door, in a fury. "A Calloway," he said. "The Saloon woman owns the majority. 51%. She'll have the presidency by right at the next vote. We cannot have it. It is not in the character of this institution." The old men agreed. They always agreed with Pruitt. And they moved, that same week, to freeze the transfer, to call an emergency session and vote the sale void as not in keeping with the standing and character of the bank. They dressed it up in the language of charters and bylaws. What they meant was plain enough. She was the wrong sort, and they would not have her, and they believed a room full of frightened old men could unmake a lawful thing by wanting to. And in the same black week, a foreclosure notice was tacked to the gatepost of the Calloway ranch. Amos had borrowed, too, in the dry year, against his own land, 40 head lost to the drought and a note he'd taken quiet. Too proud to tell even Josie the size of it until it was done, the bank he did not know his wife owned had sent the paper. The clerk who tacked it up did not know either. It was just a notice, one of many that spring. The valley found out fast, the way a valley does, and the whisper started at the store and ran to the church and back. She'd cut and run. That was the whisper. The saloon woman had city money now, shares in a bank up in Cheyenne, and the Calloway ranch was going under, and a woman like that, a woman who'd trapped a good man for his land, a woman like that would take her money and leave Amos Calloway to drown. Harriet Ashby said it plainest, over her quilting frame. "Watch," she said. "She'll be gone by summer. Their kind always is." Amos read the foreclosure notice on the gatepost and did not say a word all through supper. Then, at the table, with the lamp low, he pushed his plate back. "Josie," he said, "sell my part loose from yours. Cut the ranch off from you clean. Let it go under on my name alone. You keep the bank. You keep what you built." His voice broke on it. "I won't have my bad year drag down the one good thing you ever made for yourself. I married you to give you a life, not to hang a millstone on you. Let me go under alone." It was the proudest, hardest, most loving thing the man had ever said to her, and it was exactly wrong, and she loved him for every word of it. Josie reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. "Amos Calloway," she said, "I did not marry you for a good year. I married you for you. There is no ranch loose from me, and no me loose from the ranch. Do you hear? We go under together, or we don't go under at all." She held his eyes. "And we are not going under. Look at me. We are not." He looked at her. Something in his shoulders came down that had been up since the drought started. He turned his hands over and held hers back, and neither of them said anything for a while, and that was the moment the whole town got wrong. That was the moment the gold digger slur died, right there at a kitchen table, though the town wouldn't know it for weeks yet. The next morning, Josie rode to Cheyenne one more time, to the territorial charter clerk, the man who kept the record of every bank in the territory. She laid her certificate on his desk and asked him plain, could a board vote unmake a lawful sale it did not like? The clerk read the paper. He read it twice. He was a dry, careful man, and he took his time. "No, ma'am," he said at last. "This is filed. This is recorded. This is done. A board can wish all it wants. 51% is 51%. On the day of the vote, you hold the majority, and the majority elects the president, and there is nothing 3 old men can do to stop it but resign in a huff." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You'll want to be in the room." "I mean to be," Josie said. And the board, in its arrogance, set its emergency session for the very day the spring notes came due. They meant to void her first, then handle the loans clean, gentleman to gentleman, with the Valley's husbands lined up to plead, and the Valley's wives up in the gallery to watch their men set the bank to rights. They set the stage themselves. Every author of her wound in one room. She could not have arranged it better if she'd tried. The morning of the meeting came bright and cool. The whole valley came in for it. The husbands came in their good coats with their notes folded in their pockets. The wives came in their bonnets and climbed to the gallery above the boardroom floor. Harriet Ashby sat in the front of the gallery, of course, where she could be seen. Ruth Vane sat further back with her hands in her lap. Down on the floor, the 3 old boardmen sat at the long table, and Silas Pruitt stood at the head of it with the president's nameplate before him and a paper in his hand. Amos brought Josie in a wagon and let her down at the door. He did not come in. She'd asked him to wait. This part was hers. Pruitt called the room to order. He cleared his throat, and he began. and his voice had the oily calm of a man who thinks he's about to win. "Gentlemen," he said, "before we take up the matter of the spring notes, the board must address an irregularity in the ownership of this institution. A block of shares has been acquired by a party the board finds unsuitable, not in keeping with the character of the Cattlemen's Trust. We are convened to vote that acquisition void." And 2, the door at the back of the room opened. Josie Calloway walked in, her only good dress, brushed and pressed, her back straight, her reticule on her arm. She walked up the center of that boardroom, past the husbands in their chairs, past Ezra Ashby, and she did not hurry, and the room went dead quiet the way a room does when it feels something turning under it that it does not yet understand. She stopped at the head of the table, beside Silas Pruitt, and she set her gloved hand flat on the wood. "You'll find the acquisition is lawful, Mr. Pruitt," she said. Her voice was low and easy, and it carried to every corner, filed and recorded with the Territorial Charter Office. "I have the paper here. You may read it aloud to the board, or I will." Pruitt's mouth opened. No sound came out of it. He looked at the paper in her hand, and then he looked, for the first time since she'd walked in, at her face, and the color went out of him. "You," he said. "Josephine Calloway," she said. "Majority owner of the Cattlemen's Trust, 51%. She let it sit in the air. Which, by the bylaws you were about to read from, elects the president of this bank. Today, in this room." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then the young clerk, standing by the wall, the same clerk Pruitt had cut off at the counter, said it out loud, quiet and clear, into the silence, "It's her, sir. It was always her." The name in the drawer. Silas Pruitt stood there with his hand on the president's nameplate. His mouth worked. He tried twice to speak and could not. And then, without a word, because there were no words left to him, he slid the nameplate away from his place, down the polished table, and drew back his hand, and could not lift his eyes to hers. The gatekeeper of the right sort, unmanned, in the room he'd guarded all his life. He sat. He looked at his own hands. He was done. Down the table, Ezra Ashby had come halfway to his feet. He'd risen out of old habit the moment the ownership question turned, his $6,200 note already half out of his coat pocket, his mouth already opening to make his case for 30 more days, because Ezra Ashby had never in his life doubted that the room would bend to him. "Now see here," he started, "on the matter of my lead note, I'll want the board to," and then it reached him. Whole, where he was, who stood at the head of the table, who held the paper, who would decide, alone, whether the Ashby range lived or died. The words dried up in his throat. His hand, still holding the note, came down slow to his side. And then, his hat. He'd taken his hat off coming in, held it against his chest. His hat began to turn in his fingers, round and round, the way a man's hat turns when he is a supplicant and has only just understood it. The biggest cattleman in the county. Begging, and not a word out yet, and already begging. Along the table the others came to it one at a time, and you could watch it move down the room like a wind through grass. Tom Ledbetter, who'd laughed at the store about the saloon woman playing at banker. The Prather brothers, who'd voted with the rest to strike her name from every list a Valley kept. Each of them, in his turn, looked at the note folded in his own hand, and then up at the woman standing where Pruitt had stood, and understood that the paper they had mocked her over, the paper that held every acre and every head they owned, now bore her signature above it. One by one the good coats seemed to shrink on their backs, and up in the gallery, Harriet Ashby understood last. Because Harriet Ashby had the furthest to fall. Josie had not looked up at the gallery once. She did not look up now, but she felt it, the moment the queen of the ranch wives put it together. Up in the front row, where she'd come to watch her husband handle the bank, Harriet's face went white. First a flush, then nothing, the blood draining clean out of it, her gloved hands rising to her collar. The woman she had lifted by 2 fingers and set at the servant's end of the table. The woman she had run off the church roll. The woman whose blue ribbon she had plucked off a jar before the whole valley. That woman was standing at the head of the Cattlemen's Trust, and Ezra was turning his hat in his hands, and there was nothing at all, that a pedigree or a pew rank could do about it. Now Josie looked up. She found Harriet's face across the room and she held it, and she spoke, and though her voice never rose above the low, easy pitch it had held all along, it reached the last corner of the gallery. I sang for the coins men threw at my feet, Mrs. Ashby. She let the room hear it. I simply picked them up. A breath. And bought the floor you're standing on. Harriet made no sound. There was no sound to make. She sat frozen in the front of the gallery with her hands at her throat, and the wives on either side of her drew back a little, the way people draw back from someone the ground has opened under, and for the first time in the whole 9 years, the room was not laughing at Josie Calloway. The room was silent for her. Josie let the silence hold a moment longer. Then she took her hand off the table, and she turned to the room, to all of them, the husbands at the table and the wives above, and she did the thing none of them expected, the thing that made it justice and not just revenge. She sat down in the president's chair. She drew the nameplate to her. And she opened the meeting. Now, she said, the spring notes, that's why you came. And that's what we'll do. Every man in this room has a note falling due today. I've read them all. I read them a long time before any of you knew there was anything to read. She laid the folded certificate down and put her ledger beside it, the clothbound one, the one she'd written a single figure in at a churchyard fence 2 years back. So here are the terms. The same terms, for every man. Read them once and hear them plain. And she read them out so all could hear that it was a gift. 30 days more on every note, to start, past the roundup deadline, grass first, then payment. Honest interest, the same rate to every borrower, from Ezra Ashby's $6,200 down to the smallest note in the valley. No man foreclosed who could work his land. No family put off ground it had broken and held. Mr. Ashby. She looked at Ezra, and Ezra looked at his hat. Your lead note stands. Same rate as every man's. You'll keep your range. She let that land. Not because you'd have done the same for me. We both know you wouldn't. Because a bank that ruins the valley it lives in is a fool's bank, and I did not buy a fool's bank. Ezra Ashby, the biggest cattleman in the county, sat down slow and did not trust himself to speak. Then she came to the Vanes. Deacon Vane. Hollis Vane stood at the back, hat in both hands, and he did not lean on anything, and he had not asked for anything he hadn't earned. You did everything right, and the sky did you wrong. That's not a debt of character. That's a debt of weather. She looked at her ledger. The bank forgives a portion of your note outright, the rest at the same honest rate as everyone. You keep your land, Deacon, and you keep it clean. Hollis Vane's jaw worked. He got out, Ma'am, there's no way I can, you can, Josie said, by holding on. That's the whole of it. And then she looked up past him, into the gallery, and found Ruth Vane's face in the back row. Ruth, who had worn a ribbon she didn't earn, and been ashamed and stayed silent. Josie held her eyes just a moment. It was not an accusation. It was the opposite. It said, I know it wasn't you. I never once thought it was you. And Ruth Vane put her face in her hands and wept, not from shame this time, and her shoulders shook, and her husband kept his land, and the account between those two women, the one who'd been made to take the ribbon and the one it was stolen from, was settled without a single word said aloud. That was the whole of the reckoning. No man ruined, no family turned out. The proud kept their acres by the mercy of the woman they'd called Saloon trash, and she read the terms aloud so every one of them would carry home the plain knowledge that it was a gift, given by the giver they had scorned. The decent were saved outright. The arrogant were saved too, and had to live, from that day, knowing whose hand had done it. Josie closed the ledger. "That's the business," she said. "Meeting's done. Go put your herds on the grass." And she stood, and the husbands stood when she stood, every one of them, Ezra Ashby included, the whole table of them up on their feet for the saloon woman. And it was not fear that did it, and it was not manners. It was the thing a person does, at last, in front of someone they have wronged and been carried by anyway. She walked back down the center of the room the way she'd come, and this time the silence opened before her like water, and Amos was waiting at the door with the wagon. And she took his arm, and they drove home through the returning green. Behind her, up in the gallery, Harriet Ashby sat a long time after the room had emptied. Nobody came to sit beside her. The grass came back that year. It always does, after. The rains found the valley again, and the hills went from brown to a green so hard and bright it hurt to look at, and the herds fattened, and the notes got paid on the honest terms Josie had read aloud, and the Cattlemen's Trust, solvent now, careful now, run right, kept every ranch in the county on its land. The men who'd mocked her paid her back to the penny and tipped their hats when they passed her on the road, and meant it, mostly, and the ones who didn't quite mean it tipped them anyway, which came to the same thing in a small place. The slur died. You can't call a woman saloon trash in a town where she carried the whole valley through a drought on fair terms. The words just stopped fitting in people's mouths. Some of them likely still thought it, late at night, the way small people do. But nobody said it. And after a while, with nobody saying it, it was as good as gone. A year on, it was fall again. The good kind of fall, the kind with cottonwoods gone gold along the creek and wood smoke standing straight up in the cool evening air. The Calloway ranch had come through whole. The 40 head lost to the drought had been made up and more. The foreclosure notice was long gone off the gatepost, the note behind it paid, the land theirs free. Josie and Amos sat on their porch at dusk, with the ledgers closed for the day. Her hand was in his. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The valley below them was putting up its supper fires, and somewhere down there was a bank with her name on the door, and somewhere down there were 40 women who had once believed they knew who she was, and now knew better. And none of it needed saying out loud on a gold evening like that one. 9 years. It had taken 9 years, from a coin thrown at her feet to a name on a bank. She thought Amos was worth the whole of it, and the bank was just the thing she'd built along the way. On the president's desk down at the Cattlemen's Trust, in a small square frame, sat a tarnished silver dollar. Thin, worn smooth, nothing much to look at. A drover had flicked it at a singer's feet her first night on the Gilded Spur stage, meaning it for an insult, meaning her to scramble for it in the sawdust. She'd picked it up. She'd kept it 9 years. She'd carried it to Cheyenne in her glove and set it on a lawyer's desk while she signed for the bank. And now it sat framed on the president's desk where every borrower could see it, the seal of the house she owned, the first coin she was ever thrown, and the last thing anyone in that valley would ever mistake for shame. There was one more thing, and it came the following week, and it was small, and it was the sweetest of all. Harriet Ashby had a note of her own to renew, a little household note, nothing like Ezra's range paper but hers, in her own name. She had to come to the bank to do it. She had to come to the counter, and pass the counter to the president's door, and knock, and be let in, and sit in the chair across the desk from the framed silver dollar, across from Josephine Calloway. Harriet sat very straight. She had rehearsed something, you could see it. She got out, stiff. "I've come about my note. I'll expect no favors. And I'll expect no punishment. Whatever you mean to charge me, charge it, and be done." Josie opened the ledger. She dipped the pen. She wrote the renewal in her own clean hand, and she said, without looking up, in a voice as dry and level as the plains in July, "Same rate as everyone, Mrs. Ashby." She blotted it. She turned it for Harriet's signature. And then she did look up, and there was no heat in it at all, no triumph, just the plain flat truth of a woman who had won so completely she had nothing left to prove. "We don't charge extra," Josie said, "for where a person came from." Harriet Ashby signed the note. Her hand was not quite steady. She said thank you, because there was nothing else to say, and she went out through the counter and out the door into the fall sunlight, and that was the last time she ever tried to be anything but civil to Josephine Calloway for the rest of her natural life. That's the whole of it. A woman sang for the coins men threw at her feet in a Wyoming saloon in 1881, and the respectable wives of the valley called her trash, and struck her name off their rolls and stole the ribbon off her jar. And she never once raised her voice. She just counted. Every slight, every coin, every thin line in the bank's own numbers. And when the dry year came and the proud men reached for credit, the quietest woman in the county was already holding the paper. Worth isn't born. It's built, quiet, by the person nobody's watching. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the one to fear. Fear the one in the corner with the ledger, adding it all up. If a story like Josie's is one you needed to hear tonight, if you've ever been judged for where you came from instead of who you became, then do one small thing before you go. Tell me the name of your town in the comments. I read every one. Let's see how far this valley reaches.